out.
Straining for a look at one last look at the casket of President Eisenhower and for a look at President Nixon.
Dan, I suppose that of all those participating, of course, in these services, must be most poignant, other than the immediate family, the brothers, for those really old comrades in arms of General Eisenhower's, thinking of those pictures we had a moment ago of General Omar Bradley standing at attention, saluting, still a fine figure of a man at 76. But he and General Wade Hayslip, who is also an honorary pallbearer there, have probably known Mr. Eisenhower longer than anyone except his brothers, and even longer than Dr. Milton Eisenhower, who was the youngest of the Eisenhower brothers and is just 69 now. General Bradley's 76. He was a classmate of General Eisenhower's at West Point. General Hayslip helped him get into West Point and was an advisor in West Point. So they are very close, of course. There in the background, a moment ago, you saw Shah Pahlavi of Iran. Back
Walter,
to you, Dan.
you were speaking of comrades in arms. One of the lesser-known foreign comrades in arms of General Eisenhower, Lord Mountbatten of Burma, in this group here, and he will be accompanying the cortege down to 16th and Constitution Avenue. Prime Minister of Australia, Gordon, you can see just in the upper left quadrant of your screen facing us. The Shah of Iran is the gentleman with the braid on his hat. Of course, the Shah of Iran, in addition to being head of state, heads his country's military and thus the military uniform. He has a long saber which drags, almost clanks on the ground. The Shah of Iran does. Walter, as we wait here on this iron gray day and underneath the tower of the National Cathedral, for no particular reason, just some words of James Reston of the New York Times about General Eisenhower come to mind. Something that Scotty Reston wrote a long while ago, but seems appropriate somehow for this moment. He was saying that Eisenhower was a Horatio Alger kind of hero, one who believed in goodness, rising from that Abilene dairy to the White House, and confident to the end, not only that everything will come out all right, but that it actually has come out all right. And that in these days of cool cats, that all has a lovely nostalgic ring, an idea and an ideal not without value at a time when it's fashionable to be cynical and sour.
This was undoubtedly the secret of his appeal, I think.
The hearse stands alone by... Sorry,
so
Walter,
clear.
just saying
go ahead.
That the hearse stands alone by this shrubbery. But all of the automobiles seem now to be in their places, and the people who are supposed to be in them in those automobiles. And my guess is the cortege is just about ready to move from the cathedral down the rather steep incline. It'll be slippery. As we mentioned, most of the limousines have had snow tires put on them overnight, anticipating this wet day, but some do not. I believe that if you can see just down that line of military people, you'll see Mountbatten of Burma.
You know,
he has
Dan,
his back to us. Yes, Walter?
The penny press, as it's sometimes called, in Great Britain and London was trying to make much of the fact that Lord Mountbatten was sent here instead of the Queen herself coming, or perhaps another member of the royal household, Prince Philip, or the young to be Prince of Wales. They quoted, not directly but indirectly, and without the names being mentioned, prominent Americans who thought it was a slight. I personally have not heard that, and think it's sort of something of a dreamed-up story. After all, Lord Mountbatten was a comrade in arms of General Eisenhower's throughout the war, a great figure of World War II in his own right, and seems to me quite an adequate representative of the British Empire here today.
Walter, I think one of the things that brought that on, perhaps, you may recall that when Winston Churchill died, President Johnson, former President Johnson, wanted very badly to go to the Churchill funeral, but was prevented from doing so by illness. And instead of sending Vice President Hubert Humphrey, President Johnson sent the Secretary of State, the Chief Justice, and an otherwise star-studded diplomatic representation to the funeral of Winston Churchill. But you may recall that the same general press that is now making something to do about the Queen or Prince Charles or Prince Philip not being here, at that time was very critical of what was considered, I think, by most Americans, quite a good and adequate representation there. It may be worth pointing out that the funeral cortege, once it leaves, it's leaving now, National Cathedral, will, we believe, be passing in front of the British Embassy on Massachusetts Avenue, and should be passing just in front of that marvelous statue of Winston Churchill, the one that has Churchill, one hand raised in a V for victory signal, and in the other hand a cigar.
There's Lord Mountbatten now.
Mountbatten. He has not yet taken his place in an automobile. The hearse itself is winding toward the west entrance, that is, the front entrance of the cathedral grounds. Following it, the limousine carrying members of the family and the presidential limousine. The route of the cortege will be from the cathedral west to Wisconsin Avenue, for those of you who know Washington well, then on down Woodley Street, 34th Street, Massachusetts Avenue, Waterside Drive, then along the beautiful Rock Creek Parkway, then to Virginia Avenue, and on to 16th Street and Constitution Avenue, where the transfer of the casket will be made to the horse-drawn caisson. The ceremony in front of the cathedral took, as was planned, 20 minutes almost to the second. The limousines bearing President Nixon and Vice President Agnew stacked up just behind the hearse. Governor Rockefeller, who was one of the early visitors here this afternoon. Now the presidential limousine is pulling in behind some of those limousines bearing members of the Eisenhower family, and the cortege has started to move again. Slowly and now a bit more rapidly. The snow has stopped. A breeze from the east and north has picked up. Some of the crowd of between 3,000 and 4,000 here at the cathedral begins to drift away. Small knot of people waiting at the cathedral entrance on Wisconsin Avenue. Several wondrous magnolia trees near that entrance, but their leaves are still shriveled from winter and the early spring days that have been so wintry here in Washington. The limousine of Vice President Agnew now has started to roll. We can see off away from the screen, but it too has moved into its place in the cortege. Now the other limousines falling into place behind that of the Vice President, and the cortege begins to move quickly. And it's on its way from the National Cathedral, where the body of President Eisenhower was in repose for better than 24 hours. Now it's on its way to 16th and storied Constitution Avenue, between the Washington Monument and the White House, which for 8 years was the home of Dwight David Eisenhower and his family. Here at the Cathedral, in the one brief ceremony that was held for General Eisenhower, he was referred to, as is the form in Episcopal churches, only as Dwight David.
Oh, yeah.
Approximately 3 dozen long, low limousines, almost all of them black, those not black, olive green. Part of the cortege is making its way down Wisconsin Avenue, down the hill where the cathedral is located. The route is virtually all downhill toward the Potomac River, in that the White House and the Washington Monument both are on comparatively flat land along the river bank. As you can see, some of the dignitaries who were here for this final ceremony at the cathedral today are still here waiting for their respective limousines to come by and pick them up. The formal official funeral services on Monday for President Eisenhower will be held back here at the cathedral. It is for those ceremonies that many foreign dignitaries, such as France's General de Gaulle, South Vietnam's Premier Ky, are coming to Washington. Now, as the last of the funeral cortege leaves the National Cathedral grounds, the Coast Guard Academy band begins to march away to the beat of a muffled drum.
And Dan, we are going to pause now for station identification. So the casket bearing the body of General Dwight David Eisenhower is en route from the National Cathedral, St. Albans Hill, the northwest section of Washington, down through Rock Creek Park and Constitution Avenue to 16th and Constitution, where it will be transferred to the horse-drawn caisson and the cortege on up Constitution Avenue to the National Capitol, where it will rest in the rotunda until tomorrow afternoon, when it will be taken back to the cathedral for the funeral services, and then on to Abilene for burial in the late president's boyhood hometown. The cortege is now headed toward the intersection of 16th and Constitution, within sight of the White House that was President Eisenhower's home for 8 years. At that point, in a few minutes, the casket will be transferred from hearse to horse-drawn caisson, and Nelson Benton reports.
It is from this spot just south of the White House and virtually within the shadow of the Washington Monument that the funeral cortege of General Eisenhower will begin its final phase in the movement toward the Capitol. Here at 16th Street and Constitution Avenue in Washington, right in the middle of this intersection, the casket will be moved from the funeral hearse to a horse-drawn caisson. And that caisson will follow numerous military units over the 16 blocks east to the Capitol, where General Eisenhower's body will lie in state. Crowds line the streets now. The crowd's perhaps thin because of intermittent snow. They've been waiting for many hours. That movement of the cortege will begin just a short while from now. Nelson Benton at 16th and Constitution. Now back to Walter Cronkite.
And waiting up at Capitol Hill at the Capitol, Roger Mudd will be reporting the scene from up there as we get to that point in the proceedings this afternoon. The members of the Eisenhower family who will be seen from time to time are, of course, the widow, Mrs. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who the whole world knows as Mamie, Mr. and Mrs. John Eisenhower. He rose to colonel in the United States Army, was himself a West Point graduate. He graduated by some coincidence of history on D-Day in 1944. He is the ambassador designate to Belgium. Mrs. G. Gordon Moore, Mrs. Eisenhower's sister, will be seen. Mr. and Mrs. David Eisenhower, he's the 20-year-old grandson who was the apple of the late general's eye. We watched him grow up in news pictures, his first golf game, being instructed in how to cast for trout, favorite sport of Mr. Eisenhower's, his grandfather, and then this rather remarkable, another coincidence of history, that he should marry the daughter of the present President of the United States, Mr. Richard Nixon, who they had met when Mr. Eisenhower was the president and Mr. Nixon was his vice president. The caisson awaits there at 16th and Constitution. A moment ago you saw that beautiful horse that will be the riderless horse in the procession. That is a horse called Raven, a 10-year-old gelding. He will ride in the procession with the empty saddle, the boots turned backward in the stirrups, in the military tradition of a fallen hero. That caisson has a little history of its own. It was built back in the early days of World War I as a cannon-carrying caisson. The cannon was removed and a flatbed was placed on it back in 1918, and ever since then it's been used for these state funerals and for funerals at Arlington. This honor guard, as I think Nelson Benton or one of our correspondents reported a little bit earlier, I guess it was Roger Mudd up on the Hill, was telling us that this honor guard is not idle between these state funerals, but participates in as many as 6 funerals a day at Arlington National Cemetery. And we might mention at this moment that we have had inquiries as to why General Eisenhower is not being buried at Arlington. It's simply because it was his choice to be buried in his boyhood home at Abilene. And as a matter of fact, there are only 2 presidents buried at Arlington National Cemetery, President Taft and President John Kennedy. And now, Roger Mudd, you're waiting at Capitol Hill.
The flag, of course, here is at half-staff, the single flag that dominates the east facade of the Capitol building, along the rim of the ceiling and the roof at the Capitol policeman stationed awaiting the arrival of this cortege from the base of Capitol Hill. The rain has stopped here. The crowd is numbering perhaps 1,500, considerably larger than 2 hours ago. Most of them are equipped with rain gear and folding chairs, umbrellas, held back by plastic cords and ropes, and the evenly spaced cordon of members of the 3rd Battalion, the Old Guard, backed up by Metropolitan Police. Cortege will come into the Capitol from the north and stop at the base of the Capitol steps to be met by a reception committee composed of Deputy Defense Secretary David Packard, Army Secretary Razor, Navy Secretary Chafee, the Secretary of the Air Force Robert Siemens, and members of the Congress not to exceed 150, and the Diplomatic Corps, which arrived here a few moments ago, about 114 or 15. Already in place in the rotunda itself is the presidential lectern, which the Signal Corps brought up in an unmarked black White House truck. That's been in place with microphones. The eulogy reportedly will be brief, not to exceed 5 minutes. And following that, the honored guests and mourners will leave, and the rotunda will be open then to the public. This crowd has waited patiently, occasional laughing, and but generally waiting in place for the arrival here. 3 wreaths to be placed at the area around the casket. The President himself will place his before the casket, and then one each from the House and the Senate. This is Roger Mudd at the Capitol. Back to Walter Cronkite.
Some 2,100 invitations have been issued by telegram, for the most part, for the services at the Cathedral tomorrow. And with the rather sizable delegations from the government, which invited through courtesy and protocol, the foreign representatives and so forth, it doesn't leave a great many for personal friends of General Eisenhower's. Those details were being handled in part by his son, John Eisenhower, and in great part by his longtime aide, Brigadier General Bob Schultz. They have been very busy making these personal arrangements that can only be made at the last moment, although all of this military panoply we see in the ceremony was laid down 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, 1966, and has been on file ever since. Very few changes were made in that plan approved by General Eisenhower himself since the plans were first made. Nelson Benton at 16th and Constitution.
Walter, we're looking right now at that intersection, and the crowd here has grown considerably in the past half hour or so. From 16th and Constitution moving east to the Capitol, people are lined up 8, 10 deep in this rather bitter weather. That the caisson that was built to carry an artillery piece, and it is used frequently now in military funerals, and in this one for General Eisenhower. It was used as recently as Friday at Arlington Cemetery to bury 2 veterans of the war in Vietnam. This intersection has gradually filled as the day has worn on. It's not quiet, but neither is it noisy. There are a few commands from police. Occasionally a police car goes by. This very busy Constitution Avenue was sealed off to normal traffic nearly 2 hours ago. And at all sides, people line the sidewalks waiting for the motorized cortege to move in. And at this point, President Eisenhower's body will be changed from the hearse to the caisson. The caisson unit is from the 1st Battalion, 3rd Infantry, the so-called Old Guard at Fort Myer. Consists of 6, it is pulled by 6 horses, 3 of them riderless, 3 with riders. That's a custom that has come out of military funerals of the past. The riderless horses, a symbol from the frontier days when those horses were used to carry supplies.
It mustn't be assumed, Nelson, that the 3rd Battalion, Infantry Battalion, is just a show unit. It's got a long and distinguished battle history as well, but it is the nation's ceremonial unit now from its Fort Myer base, and they're probably the best example in the world of the spit and polish soldier.
It has indeed quite a record, Walter. I think it missed Korea. I don't believe it has served in Vietnam, but it has a long history down through the years.
Nelson, although the crowds are not what might be called overwhelming today, because of the weather, I'm sure, partly, the security is immense. With these crowned heads, members of royalty, these heads of state and heads of government in Washington, there has been great concern over security, of course, and we're told that there are 19,000 soldiers lining the various routes of the processions. There are some 4,000 police on the procession route alone, and there are 2,000 FBI and Secret Service, Bureau of Narcotics, Internal Revenue Service operatives, all at work in the city of Washington. Each of the dignitaries has a guard or guards, depending on the circumstances of his own. And as a matter of fact, many of them bring their own guard details. Those are integrated into the American Guard plan and are fully briefed for the maximum security for each of these leaders.
Walter?
Yeah.
I just want to mention to you, we're standing here looking up at this overcast sky with, strangely enough, the sun trying to peek through the clouds here, which takes us back, I think, to the inauguration, what was it, 1952, when it was snowing, and President Eisenhower was about to be inaugurated, and the sun started to come out.
Yes.
And the sun is well, just for a moment, it tried to peek through right down on this caisson unit waiting for the body of General Eisenhower.
We've got an aerial view, I suppose it's from the Washington Monument on one of our monitors here, and there it is, looking down Virginia Avenue toward Rock Creek Park. This scene is, you're looking west here from the monument down Virginia Avenue and the underpass there. At the end of the street, that is where Rock Creek Park turns into Virginia Avenue, or where you can turn off of Rock Creek Park onto Virginia Avenue, and the route of the cortege, which you see proceeding now up Virginia Avenue. It has about 7 or 8 blocks to run along Virginia Avenue there before it turns into Constitution Avenue. So, Nelson, they're not very far from you.
Well, they are not yet in sight of us, Walter, but they...
No, they haven't turned into Constitution yet. As a matter of fact, they're still down just about by the Watergate, as that large complex of buildings over there on the left is called.
You spoke of security, Walter, just even at this intersection. You can see just about all varieties. We see Capitol Park Police, we see military, we see Secret Service, we see Washington Metropolitan Police, and I'm sure there are many here that we don't see who intend not to be recognized just immediately.
Nelson, as we look at a picture there of the south portico of the White House across the ellipse from where you are, 16th and Constitution, I'm reminded of the fact that, you remember there was a lot of criticism at the time that President Truman put that so-called back porch on the White House, and we see the cortege moving down Virginia Avenue here. Well, there was a lot of criticism at the time, and of course that is the wont of American politics. A lot of it was directed at the president by the out party at the time, the Republicans. But when Truman's successor came to the White House, General Eisenhower, he admitted to his friends that he liked that back porch on there. And I think that perhaps the presidents since then have. The cortege proceeding down Virginia Avenue in this rather extraordinary shot on a very long lens from the top of the Washington Monument some distance away. I suppose linear distance, that must be almost a mile down there.
It's better than that, I expect, Walter. We're, practically at the monument. And as we look to the west down Constitution Avenue, we still do not have the cortege in sight.
Well, you'll see it turning in there very shortly. In fact, there it is right now.
I have it now, yes.
Just saw a motorcycle policeman coming in. There they are.
Now, we do see cars moving into sight around Virginia Avenue into Constitution, moving to the east. A lone motorcycle policeman in the very front of the cortege. The riderless horse, the 10-year-old Raven, which will walk at the rear of the caisson unit, is away from the caisson unit right now, being sort of exercised off to the side. The lead cars of the cortege now moving up abreast of the caisson unit. These cars, these forward cars, will move well ahead of the caisson unit, which will carry the body of General Eisenhower. The hearse, now just about 3 cars in the cortege away from the caisson unit. All of the limousines going to the south of the cortege. The hearse now moving to the north side of Constitution Avenue, positioning itself parallel between the caisson and the White House. And it stops. Honorary pallbearers, some of them moving into position. See. See among the honorary pallbearers now former Admiral Straws, General Bradley, his uniform of a general of the armies with 5 stars.
Nelson, is that by chance the aerial salute passing overhead, those 21 jets?
No, Walter, as you know, we are very close to National Airport. It's just barely across the river. That's a commercial airliner leaving Washington National. We have not, there's been some speculation about that fighter salute, by the way, because of fairly low-hanging ceiling, but we've had no word that it would not be carried off with the 21 F-4 fighters.
Six of them drawing the caisson.
The honorary pallbearer group lined up now, facing to the north, facing the caisson. Their backs to the Washington Monument.
For more than half hour.
General Bradley, Admiral Anderson. Admiral Anderson, who we're told, replacing Admiral Arthur Radford, who is, we're told, is ill. General Alfred Grunter, General Collins, Dr. Milton Eisenhower, Edgar Eisenhower, the general's brothers, General Lawrence Norstad, now the detail moving toward the casket. Enlisted men from all of the armed services. Marching at slow cadence. Eight of them under the command of a single officer. Eisenhower's casket now being removed from the hearse. The military present arms, among them distinguished generals who are among the honorary pallbearers.
Now very slowly, with great majesty,
The casket detail now stepping slowly, one step at a time, away from the hearse. The casket now approaching the caisson. To the very left, General Eisenhower's casket, the Joint Chiefs of Staff at present arms. General of the Armies Dwight Eisenhower, his casket being loaded aboard a caisson.
Order arms has been given, and drop the arms to your side, and I'll stand in guard. Finish your touches.
movement is the honorary pallbearers leaving their position, going to automobiles. The chiefs of staff moving to their vehicles. The leader of the caisson detail faces his horse forward. Color guard, a three-man color guard. The national standard carried by a soldier, flanked on his left by a sailor, on his right by a Marine, moving forward. The riderless horse, which has been off to the side of Constitution Avenue, now moving into position behind the caisson, boots at either side, reversed, with a saber at the right side of the horse.
Boots are in the stirrup, facing backwards, symbolic of the fact that the horse's rider has fallen. The horse they're using today is Raven.
Now the motorized part of the cortege is starting to move. The caisson section is remaining fast for the moment. Caisson detail now starting to move with some 16 blocks from the spot just south of the White House, carrying the casket of Dwight Eisenhower to the Capitol. This horse, Raven, with the reversed boots, the spurred boots, is a 10-year-old horse. It's not the same horse. It is not the same horse that was used at the funeral of General MacArthur, nor that of President Kennedy.
That horse, I believe, Nelson, was Blackjack.
That's right, Walter. Blackjack, we're told, is still alive, but it's at Fort Myer today.
Back in his stall at Fort Myer. I suppose perhaps retired from these. He's around 20, isn't he now?
That's correct, Walter. The president's limousine is about 9 cars back from the caisson that is carrying General Eisenhower. And of course the procession of limousines stretches even farther back, just as far as we can see along Constitution Avenue.
This is the first look we've had at the marching units in this cortege. They consist of the United States Army Band, the company of U.S. Corps of Cadets from the U.S. Military Academy, representative company, the United States Brigade of Midshipmen, a company from Annapolis. Each of these companies consists of 4 cadet officers and 85 cadets or midshipmen in the case of the Naval Academy. A similar unit from the U.S. Cadet Wing at the U.S. Air Force Academy and from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. And then similar size, 85-man units from the Army, from the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard, and a composite company of service women of the U.S. Army, the Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Air Force. It's 5 officers and 19 women from each service forming that composite company. And the United States Navy Band will be in the procession next. A company from the National Guard, from the Army Reserve, from the Marine Reserve, the Naval Reserve, the Air National Guard, the Air Force Reserve, Coast Guard Reserve, and national host of the Veterans Day Committee, the United States Air Force Band, the commanders of 32 veterans organizations, the Honor Guard, and then the honorary pallbearers, and the part of that cortege which you have seen quite a lot of earlier this morning. The marching units have been formed up several hours. They're on Constitution Avenue from 16th, stretching up to 12th, until they have just begun, as you see, to move out. The entire proceeding running about a half hour behind the carefully laid schedule planned for it. They'd brought Blackjack along. He was just a little more docile than Raven, who was much younger, seems to be. On now at about 15th Street and Constitution Avenue. Leaves the ellipse behind. Begins now to pass the almost solid row of government buildings that line Constitution Avenue. One reason that Constitution is chosen as a route for such processions is the comparative ease of security here, since there are no private buildings on this entire route. They're all public buildings and consequently can be much more easily policed. There are no persons, cameras permitted on the roofs of these buildings today. The buildings themselves have been closed off and are under guard. Not a great number of the 200 foreign dignitaries scheduled to be here for the actual funeral service tomorrow are in Washington yet, and only a few are participating in this part of the 3 days of funeral services, memorial services for the late General and President. The Shah of Iran, who we saw at the National Cathedral a little earlier, is the ranking representative of the foreign states here as of this hour, and in this procession. There are 8 other principal foreign representatives in the group, that is, who had come from abroad besides the ambassadors, and some of the ambassadors from some of these nations rank very high in their own countries, of course. The Lord Mountbatten is there today, Lord Mountbatten of Burma, the Prime Minister John Gorton of Australia, the Deputy Prime Minister Frank Aiken of Ireland, Maharaji Desai, the Deputy Prime Minister of India, Saretse Kama, the President of Botswana, Eugene Schaus, and Prince Jean of Luxembourg are here so far. President de Gaulle, President of Germany, Kiesinger, President of Austria, the Vice President of South Vietnam, General Cao Ki, are all due in Washington later today. Now this is 14th Street. Rain and the occasional snow flurries have stopped. Nelson Benton reported to us a little earlier the sun seems to be trying to come out. body of President Eisenhower approaches Capitol Hill, it brings to mind his second inaugural address, delivered on January 20th, 1957. It demonstrates his all-embracing humanity. Here are some excerpts from that address.
One truth must rule all we think and all that we do. No people can live to itself alone. The unity of all who dwell in freedom is their only sure defense. The economic need of all nations in mutual dependence makes isolation an impossibility. Not even America's prosperity could long survive if other nations did not prosper. No nation can longer be a fortress, lone and strong and safe. And any people seeking such shelter for themselves can now build only their own prison. Our pledge to these principles is constant because we believe in their rightness. We do not fear this world of change. America is no stranger to much of its spirit. Everywhere we see the seeds of the same growth that America itself has known. The American experiment has for generations fired the passion and the courage of millions elsewhere seeking freedom, equality, opportunity. And the American story of material progress has helped excite the longing of all needy peoples for some satisfaction of their human wants. These hopes that we have helped to inspire, we can help to fulfill. And so we voice our hope and our belief that we can help to heal this divided world. Thus may the nation cease to live in trembling before the menace of force. Thus may the weight of fear and the weight of arms be taken from the burdened shoulders of mankind. This, nothing less, is the labor to which we are called and our strength dedicated. And so, the prayer of our people carries far beyond our own frontiers to the wide world of our duty and our destiny. May the light of freedom, coming to all darkened lands, flame brightly, until at last the darkness is no more. May the turbulence of our age yield to the true time of peace, when men and nations shall share a life that honors the dignity of each, the brotherhood of all.
That was from the President's second inaugural address. John Hart is at 7th and Constitution Avenues. John?
Walter, looking west from 7th and Constitution toward the caisson, we can see what appears to be a drape of clouds pulling back, almost as if the sun were following General Eisenhower down this historic avenue. Passing now the